Hi, I'm Vlad Spara and I usually know things. And I don't know if you've ever happened to see, for example, a movie like The Patriot, where rows of perfectly aligned soldiers march against each other and start shooting while standing. And you definitely thought, my God, what a stupid thing. How stupid those people from the past must have been, marching in perfect lines and letting themselves get shot in the open field. And I've noticed that everyone who is even slightly interested in military history will eventually come to this conclusion that line tactics, line infantry tactics were stupid, but were they really stupid? Let's find out. The standard weapon of the infantry, actually for the entire 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, was the smoothbore flintlock musket. And it's interesting to note how, in that era, as far as technology was concerned, they were in a so-called evolutionary plateau. Because, for example, let's take the English Brown Bess musket, which was introduced around 1715, and it remained practically the same, except for small variations until the 1830s, basically 120 years of service, almost unchanged. And moreover, this makes us think that it was an era of armies marching against each other in line, shooting at one another, but actually, even though that was the standard weapon for the infantry tactics and everything else around it evolved a lot. Another point I'd like to make before entering this world. Specifically, I've noticed that often when discussing history, we somehow feel smarter or better than the people who lived in the past. We're not smarter than they were. It's not that they were stupid. Sure, today we know things they couldn't have known, but we have more knowledge. We're not more intelligent. It's a different thing. I could mention the famous Columbus's egg example. Go look up where the right tactics come from, probably the line tactics. That is, trying to maximize the firepower of the infantry by deploying them in lines, arranging them in a very wide formation. It began during the 30 Years' War. Can we discuss who was the first to adopt this kind of tactics? Maybe the Dutch then were copied by the French, who with these new tactics defeated the famous Spanish tercios, or was it Gustavus's Swedes? Gustavus Adolphus, who made several reforms to his army. One of the things he did is, he increased the proportion of musketeers compared to pikemen, also because at that time infantry formations were mixed formations with muskets or arquebuses and pikes. Gustavus Adolphus increased this proportion, he put in more musketeers. Actually, 2/3 of the infantry were armed with firearms. The rest were pikemen, with the spread, because it actually already existed as a sack, but with the spread of the flintlock musket, and especially with the increasing spread of the bayonet. The pike begins to disappear, though it never fully vanishes and actually lasts a surprisingly long time. In some ways, especially in second or third rate units. Why the formation and why the line? The formation has two major advantages. The first advantage is that it's easy to control your troops, because if the troops move as a single body, as a single unit, it's easy to move, it's easy to give orders, it's easy to observe what's happening. A mass of people is a crowd, not an army, and so formation helps a lot in making decisions. In the chain of command, you advance, retreat, move, and so on. It helps a lot to direct any movement you make, whether it's attack or defense. The second very important thing that formation does, which is often forgotten, is that despite the decline of medieval knights of the past, cavalry is still a very important branch of the army and is an absolutely feared weapon. In reality, the only way to defend against cavalry was to maintain formation. Cavalry, above all, has a very strong psychological impact. In movies, unfortunately, they'll simply show you the charge from The Lord of the Rings, where the horses magically run into formations, trampling people. Horses don't do that. Horses aren't stupid. If the infantry stays compact, the horse will basically stop or turn and go somewhere else. It avoids getting impaled by pikes or similar objects. And so resisting a cavalry attack required formation and a lot of discipline. And actually, an interesting point in mixed formations, pikes and muskets. People think that muskets are for fighting infantry and pikes are for cavalry. But actually, it's the opposite. Pikes are used to fight other infantry, and muskets are actually used to take out cavalry. It's a big exaggeration, but just to say, often these facts about military history are sometimes counterintuitive. So getting back to us, The formation has a practical use for organization, coordination, and it also has a defensive use, especially against cavalry. Why the line? Because with the line you can bring as many muskets as possible to the front, more firepower. Switching to the Spanish tercios, which were squares, they were very compact and very powerful defensively. They weren't that good offensively, because at any given moment they couldn't fully use all the firepower they had. And so we witness a process from the 1600s through the 1700s gradually, in which the infantry lines become increasingly narrower. It starts more or less from 6 lines of mixed formations of musketeers and pikemen to the typical, we could say, 18th century formation of 3 lines. Frederick II of Prussia and his infantry were famously the top users of line tactics. The cavalry and infantry were each deployed in 3 lines. And the line was intended precisely to maximize firepower, while remaining compact so as not to be attacked by cavalry or infantry charges. I can't have scattered troops fighting against a formation even if it seems logical to us. Because in a firefight, if I have people lined up and standing compared to people who are hidden, crouched and scattered, it might seem like the best solution, but in reality those scattered people would be charged in 3 seconds by infantry and cavalry and wiped out ignobly. So actually, even if it seems stupid to us that they're standing and shooting at each other, in reality they're avoiding something much worse. That is, being attacked with melee weapons by a weapon that is in some ways much more fearsome than the musket. And so it was actually the right choice, because the choice that counterintuitively for us actually saved more men and more lives. The clashes in this sense were often won by those who had more discipline to remain steady and firm under fire, and whoever was able to reload their musket more quickly basically became everything. A contest in which here too the Prussians were quite famous for being perhaps the best at doing this. However, tactics evolve into what will be called line infantry. And already, for example, Napoleonic armies are drastically different in tactics from those of 50 years earlier, from Frederick II. The Napoleonic armies, not just the French one, but also the others, actually make quite a mixed use of tactics. Sometimes they use the line, but above all, they use the column. The column is a bit of a step back because it's a large group of men advancing and it doesn't have much firepower. The firepower is provided by the light infantry, which is usually placed in front of the columns as skirmishers in a scattered order, which is obviously more effective in a firefight, but in turn it is protected from enemy infantry and cavalry charges by the column behind it. In many cases, the weaponry remains the same because much of the light infantry still uses smoothbore muskets, even though rifled muskets are gradually being introduced. Tactics vary, tactics change, and gradually the classic line formation will fall more and more into disuse. Another major clash, actually a very interesting one. I always mention the American Civil War, which started as a Napoleonic war with lines and columns and actually ended up like the First World War, with trench systems, breech-loading weapons and things like that. And the American Civil War would actually see the peak of the failure of line tactics, tactics that were unsuccessful. Both because of technological evolution, namely the mass introduction of the rifled musket with much greater range and much more accuracy, where a person standing in formation became a much easier target. But I would dare to say that what killed line tactics was not the rifled musket, but rather the advent of light infantry tactics. In military history, there is a tactical evolution and a technological evolution that often do not go hand in hand, but rather integrate with each other. So inclusion, no. Marching in formation against each other and firing as quickly as possible. It's counterintuitive, but it was actually the smartest choice, not stupid at all. I hope you enjoyed this video, even if it was a bit confusing. As always, I'm Vlad Sparastoria. See you next time.